Okay, thanks to everybody for joining us today. My name is Michelle Oldfield, and I work with the Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory. It's my honor to introduce our moderator, Mauricio Bellon. Mauricio is a research professor for the Swette Center for Sustainable Food Systems. He is a human ecologist focusing on sustainable agriculture and food systems around the world. His research has focused on the reasons, incentives, and dynamics of crop diversity managed by farmers in their agricultural systems. All right, Mauricio, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. I am delighted to welcome our speaker, Liz Carlisle, who is an assistant professor at in the Environmental Studies program at UC Santa Barbara, where she teaches courses on food and farming. Her new book, Healing Grounds, Climate, Justice, and the Deep Roots of Regenerative Farming, tells the stories of Indigenous, Black, Latinx, and Asian American farmers who are reviving their ancestors' methods of growing food, techniques long suppressed by the industrial food system. Today, Liz will discuss in more detail the regenerative farming that will require reckoning with our nation's agricultural history, a history marked by discrimination and displacement. Okay. Before we begin, let me remind you to the audience that to please enter your questions in the Q&A feature at any time. Michelle will create questions and send them to me, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. So Liz, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Mauricio. And thank you all for the invitation to be here. And to those of you who are here, I'm looking forward to your questions. I'll just speak here for about probably 25 minutes to give you an overview of this work and some of what I've learned over the past few years. So bear with me a minute as I share my screen. All right, so this is really the question that's been motivating my work, my research for the past 12 years. I've been really interested and particularly interested in speaking with farmers about their work to transform agriculture from an environmental problem, and particularly a climate problem, to an environmental solution, and to really help us solve this pressing environmental challenge of climate change that obviously comes with a deadline. And this is a really deep question for me. It actually comes for me from my conversations with my grandmother, who lost our family farm in the Dust Bowl. And I so deeply admired the wisdom and the groundedness that my grandmother lived with, that was clearly emanating from this land connection that she had and really never lost, in a sense, this deep connection to land, this experience of having, made her livelihood directly with that land relationship. But of course, I also found her stories about that tragedy of the Dust Bowl deeply sobering. And that, in a sense, inspired me to do this work and to think about how we all heal, how we heal land, and how we heal our relationships with each other. And I really only, I think, have started uncovering those layers of the sort of social dimensions of why we have these ecological challenges in agriculture. But we have so much potential for agriculture to actually be part of the climate solution. And so that's what I'm really interested in as a researcher, is what can farmers do to make agriculture a climate solution? And what's been interesting to me in recent years is that some of my colleagues think that regenerative agriculture has tremendous promise as a solution to climate change. This team of scientists, this international team, for example, calculated that increasing soil carbon by just 0.4% each year could offset some 20 to 35% of greenhouse gas emissions caused by human activity. And this led the French government and many others to launch this initiative. They've been holding meetings at the Conference of Parties. There's a lot of folks who are quite enthused about this. And yet, others of my research colleagues are, let's say not so enthusiastic, not so convinced that there's a form of agriculture that's actually going to help us store carbon in the soil that could actually, store more emissions than it actually releases. So I started doing research for this book because I was curious about this gap between these different estimates of whether regenerative agriculture could be a really powerful climate solution or whether it was really kind of more of a marketing thing. So to try to find out, I spoke with some farmers and scientists who are leading thinkers in this arena. And I'm going to share a little bit about some of the folks who are most prominently featured in Healing Grounds. So first, and I should tell you, I was born and raised in Montana. So I looked first to Indigenous leaders in the territory where I grew up. And I met Latrice Tatsey, who's a soil ecologist from Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana, whose research focuses on the carbon sequestration potential of regenerative grazing. And like many regenerative grazing experts I've met, Latrice is a cattle producer who advocates for rotating livestock through pastures in patterns that mimic the movements of native herbivores, so as to regenerate vegetation and ultimately soil carbon. But for Latrice, native herbivores are more than just a theoretical model. Bison, or Ini, as Latrice's people call them, are considered relatives and are central to the economy, diets, cultural, and spiritual traditions of the Blackfeet people, as they are for many people indigenous to the North American prairie. So Latrice isn't just using historical bison grazing as a model, she's actually part of an effort to restore bison themselves on the North American landscape, and not just within the contemporary Blackfeet reservation established by the US government, but throughout the historical territory of both her people and these native herbivores with whom they are so closely connected. So Latrice can rattle off a whole host of reasons why bison are needed to fully restore carbon-rich prairies. By grazing selectively, bison create a diverse mosaic of vegetation across the prairie, which in turn supplies habitat for other species, including butterflies and endangered birds. Historically, when bison journeyed long distances, recently foraged vegetation had time to regrow before the animals came back. And to adapt to grazing pressure from these massive herbivores, prairie plants evolved to apportion a great deal of their efforts underground to support their extensive root systems. And these root systems, in turn, delivered carbon into the soil, where it could be bound up in minerals and stored for eons. Over the millennia, bison helped build up the North American prairie into some of the most carbon-rich earth in the world. But more fundamentally, Latrice explained to me, bison are not only a keystone species in this ecosystem, but a teacher. So throughout their long evolutionary history on the prairie, bison have learned to live in balance with their environment, and their movements and grazing behavior are a lesson for anyone who is willing to learn. Historically, Latrice's people heeded this lesson and amplified the bison's regenerative impact on the prairie by setting carefully timed fires. Now, Latrice is studying bison grazing as a model for regenerative grazing of cattle. And going forward, she hopes bison will be heeded for the even more profound lessons they have to teach about how to thrive on what is seasonally available and how to build a livelihood matched to the landscape. As part of my research for this book, I also got to know Olivia Watkins, who farms mushrooms within a patch of forest in North Carolina that her family has managed for more than 130 years. And when Olivia's great-great-uncle bought the place in 1890, he became one of the first Black landowners in the area. In the midst of rampant racial discrimination and outright racial violence, during a century when 98% of Black landowners were forcibly dispossessed of their land, The forest plot was a place of relative sanctuary for Olivia's ancestors, who initially lived off the land. Now, as the Research Triangle area of Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill is rapidly urbanizing, Olivia's land is one of the few pockets of diverse natural forest remaining, and thus it's also a sanctuary for wildlife and soil carbon. For Olivia, forest farming and agroforestry are a means of conservation in at least two senses. As she conserves threatened forest, she's also conserving threatened Black-owned land. So closer to home, to where I now live and work in California, I met Aide Guzman, an ecologist conducting a first-of-its-kind study with immigrant farmers in California's Central Valley. So as Guzman explained to me, in order to effectively sequester and store carbon, soils need to have a diverse and vibrant microbial community. And in order to have biodiversity below ground, you also need biodiversity above ground in the plant community. Or so scientists believe, based mostly on research conducted in natural areas like forests. The question isn't actually very well studied in agricultural landscapes in the US, Guzman explained to me, because in major agricultural regions like California's Central Valley, there's not a lot of agricultural biodiversity to study. But Guzman knew that there were hidden hotspots of biodiversity amidst the monocultures of almonds and grapes, because she herself grew up in the Central Valley, the daughter of farm workers who immigrated from their family's diversified small farm in Mexico. And she knew there were many families like hers, families with deep cultural traditions of growing multiple crops in diverse mixtures or polycultures, families who were farming this way on whatever patches of earth they could find. So using satellite maps and driving for hours down country roads, Guzman identified dozens of small farmers who agreed to participate in her study, comparing polycultures to monocultures. The polycultures, Guzman found, provided much better habitat for specialist native bees. But she also knew, moving on from this slide, the soil samples that she analyzed gave her an even more important piece of information. The soil samples she analyzed from these polyculture farms had 2 times as many types of arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, an indicator of that critical below ground biodiversity that is so important for carbon sequestration and other ecosystem services provided by soil. So growing up in the Central Valley, Guzman told me, she heard a lot of narratives about immigrants, not all of them positive. But as her data clearly show, the Mexican, Central American, and Southeast Asian farmers with whom she partnered on her research are literally bringing Central Valley soils back to life. And then I spoke to one other incredible regenerative agriculture leader who's featured in Healing Grounds. She's actually just down the road from where Aide Guzman grew up. So Aide grew up in Firebaugh, California, and Nikiko Masumoto cultivates 80 acres of peaches, nectarines, apricots, and raisin grapes, the 3rd generation to steward her family's Del Rey, California farm. Nikiko's grandparents bought the land and planted the first trees. And then her dad, Moss, converted the farm to certified organic production some 30 years ago. Walking the same land as those who came before her, Nikiko thinks a lot about her ancestors. Without that generational connection, Nikiko says, much of the soil building work on her family's land might never have happened. When her dad decided to come back to the farm in the 70s, they planted trees that her grandfather wouldn't have been able to tend on his own. And when Nikiko returned 3 decades later, the horizon for investing in the land expanded again. There is a gift of that, Nikiko says, which is thinking of my life in a lineage that is much more important than my own individual life. So many of the methods that develop soil take time. The horizon is long. When you're wanting to leave a farm to several generations in the future, you have a vested interest in taking up those practices. But digging into her family's history is also a painful and complicated process for Nikiko. Discriminated against as immigrants, Nikiko's great-grandparents never owned the land they worked. What little savings they had built up was lost during Japanese-American internment, when some 120,000 people, most of them US citizens, were incarcerated for years simply for the crime of their Japanese descent. So Nikiko's grandparents had to start from scratch, eking out a living on marginal land as they gradually built up the soil. We are the ones that the world needs in this climate crisis, Nikiko says, referring not just to Japanese Americans, but also to other communities of color who have experienced oppression. Because we have those stories, we have that sense of fighting against the impossible. So speaking to these 4 regenerative agriculture leaders filled me with hope. Each one of them laid out a powerful vision for how regenerative agriculture could significantly address climate change. And they were already putting these plans into action, restoring prairies, conserving forests, and demonstrating the benefits of planting polycultures and cycling nutrients. But they also made me think differently about what regenerative agriculture is and what it needs to be in order to truly address climate change and shift the destructive course of agricultural business as usual. So the first key lesson I learned from the regenerative agriculture leaders I spoke to for this research is that regenerative agriculture is not new. Yes, strategies like cover cropping and regenerative grazing may be new ideas to many US farmers who've frequently been taught that soil fertility comes out of a package and monocultures are more efficient. But this industrial approach to farming is only about 75 years old, really just a minor blip in the long history of human land management. Meanwhile, indigenous food systems have employed what we now term regenerative practices for thousands of years. For example, on this continent, indigenous people have long understood the regenerative relationship among prairies, grazing, and fire. The African continent has a long history of agroforestry, a practice that continues throughout the African diaspora. And polycultures, like those that we just saw in the agroforestry example on the African continent, polycultures are also a staple of indigenous food systems in Latin America, particularly the Three Sisters trio of corn, beans, and squash that spread throughout what scholar Devin Pena terms the indigenous corn belt long before European contact. And of course, if you've ever wondered where organic farmers got the idea for nutrient cycling practices like composting, mulching, and planting cover crops, as these classic books make very clear, one of the primary answers to that question is Asia. So these are just a few examples among many I came across in the course of my research. The key point when we're thinking about regenerative agriculture in the US is this. Regenerative agriculture is rooted in the ancestral knowledge of communities of color. So it's essential to recognize, credit, and take leadership from these indigenous communities and communities of color. Each of these diverse communities have spent decades, sometimes centuries, on the front lines of extractive agriculture. And drawing on ancestral knowledge, they have honed the practice of regenerative agriculture as a means of survival and resistance. So that brings me to the other key lesson I learned from talking with the regenerative agriculture leaders I told you about earlier, who, as you may have noticed, are all women of color. let's be clear about why we have an extractive form of agriculture in the US today. It's because extraction is the playbook of colonization. And I want to just warn you that on the next slide, we're going to see a large pile of bison skulls. And in a couple slides, we're also going to see some historical images of signs with deeply racist language. So when we think about all that soil carbon that was lost from US farmland over the past few centuries, that was part of a larger process of extraction, a process of stealing land, resources, and even people, a process of exporting wealth and resources out of communities and concentrating it in the hands of a powerful elite. Nearly all 30 million bison in North America were killed over the course of the 19th century. As land speculators and the US military understood, their strategy of exterminating most of these animals would profoundly undermine the way of life that had supported the people of the plains for thousands of years. And this genocide of indigenous peoples and their food systems, this was not the only time lands would be taken. So despite the myriad barriers that Black farmers encountered after emancipation, by 1920, 925,000 Black farmers owned the land they farmed. But severe discrimination by both the USDA and the financial sector reduced Black agricultural land ownership to a mere fraction of this peak. Black farmers lost a whopping 6 million acres in the years between 1950 and 1969 alone. As journalist Van Newkirk has calculated, this pencils out to an average daily hemorrhage of 820 acres, an area the size of New York's Central Park, erased with each sunset. And when the US and Mexican governments pushed forward with the Green Revolution in Mexico, thousands of small farmers lost their livelihoods and were forced to seek work as farm laborers in the United States, where they were systematically denied full citizenship. And this practice of exploiting displaced immigrants in the food system in the United States was not new, as in fact, waves of immigrants from Asia had had a similar experience. In late 19th and early 20th century California, the story repeated itself with one Asian immigrant community after another. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Punjabi. They came as farm workers, they hoped to become farmers, but they were systematically denied access to citizenship and land ownership, ensuring that agribusiness would always have access to a pool of legally insecure laborers. So a regenerative agriculture clearly must be a deeply rooted one. Any ecologist can tell you that. And if you are somebody who focuses on regenerative agriculture, or if you know people who focus on it, they talk about roots all the time, roots in the ground all year round, perennial plants, roots deeply rooted. And yet, colonization and its extraction playbook have been uprooting both people and the plants they tend for hundreds of years. So, how can the extractive processes of colonization be healed? That to me is the really central question underlying regenerative agriculture. How can we ensure that people are able to put down roots? So one of the other wise women that I had the privilege of speaking with as I was researching the final section of this book, thinking about sort of where we go from here, big solutions to empower regenerative agriculture led by Indigenous communities and communities of color, I got to speak with Stephanie Morningstar, who is the executive director of the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. And in the short term, this land trust negotiates equitable leases for farmers of color. So they vet landowners to ensure that terms are fair and that the place and the relationship provides a safer space for those farmers. But longer term, the trust aims to acquire at least 2,000 acres of land with the goal of providing affordable long-term leases to some 50 farmers of color who commit to regenerative agriculture covenants. And most importantly, Stephanie emphasizes, the land trust doesn't do anything without first consulting the Indigenous communities who are the original stewards of the land. And one of the primary tools Stephanie uses to work towards shared sovereignty is something called a cultural respect easement, which stipulates specific forms of Indigenous access or Indigenous informed management of land. So such easements could grant access for hunting, harvesting, ceremony, reburial of ancestors, or simply be open to definition by the Indigenous nation. And the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust is one of many organizations around the country that are currently advancing deep visions for land justice. So here in California, where I live and work, Mai Nguyen and Neil Thapar co-direct an organization called Minnow, which they founded in 2020, that focuses on preserving and securing California farmland for farmers of color and supporting Indigenous land rematriation in tandem in the same places and spaces. And actually both Aide Guzman and Nikiko Masumoto are involved in similar efforts, working to advance Indigenous sovereignty and ensure that immigrant farm workers in California have opportunities to become landowners. Also, Latrice Tatsy is involved in efforts to bolster land sovereignty at Blackfeet Nation, not just within the boundaries of the current reservation, but also on the rest of her people's historical territory, which bison need to complete their migration patterns. And Olivia Watkins is president of Black Farmer Fund, which is building wealth for Black farmers and food businesses, quote, to repair Black communities' relationships to food and land. So ultimately, what I've learned from all of these regenerative agriculture leaders is that regenerative agriculture is, in fact, a powerful climate solution. But it isn't just a menu of discrete practices that you can tally up into a sustainability score. It's a bold project to reshape our society's relationship with land and with each other. So over the past 500 years, agriculture on this continent has been a process of brutal extraction. And the scars are as present in our climate of racial injustice as they are in the gigatons of soil carbon lost to the atmosphere. Near the end of my interview with Stephanie Morningstar, I eventually asked her a very fundamental question. Just what is the climate crisis really? She actually has a background in climate change research, so I figured she'd be the person to ask. And here's what she told me, quote, "This is ancestor work. Everything that we're doing is ancestor work. Not just me, not just Black folks, not just people of color, everybody." So climate change signals a profound imbalance rooted in the violent restructuring of relationships between people and land that lies at the very heart of this continent's history. It's this rupture that disrupted the connections that make healthy, functioning ecosystems possible, including the connections that weave humans into the fabric of a place. And so that means the vital work of rebuilding soil carbon is inextricably woven together with the vital work of racial justice. What we are doing is we are healing our ancestral lineages, Stephanie clarified. It's about going back to the root issues, Indigenous land dispossession and enslavement. How do we right those relationships between our own communities so that we can heal those things in this healing ground? So healing the climate means healing land, I asked her, trying to follow her train of thought. And healing land means healing colonization. That's it, she said. That's the work. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. And of course, thank you very much to everybody who spoke with me for this book, the folks that you saw on these slides, as well as many, many other people who generously shared their insights. And I'd be delighted to take your questions. I'll stop my share here.
Okay, well, thank you, Liz. Very, very good presentation, very interesting. Let me remind the audience to please send your questions in the chat. And, but let me start before more than questions, I would like to make a comment. I read the book. I found it very good, very interesting. It was a very good read. It was, it was very easy to read, very interesting. And I learned a lot about American agriculture. I mean, I grew up and was educated outside in Mexico. And I studied agriculture. I studied agronomy in the National University, in a university in Mexico. And in a lot of ways, it's always presented American agriculture like the paradigm, like what we should aspire to do. And yeah, there are very important aspects of it, but for me, it was very interesting to read your book because you could see these other aspects that obviously are not known, not just for foreign people, but also for, I think, Americans that are important. And also to recognize the role of these smallholder, these farmers and these people that usually are ignored, and that they actually not only made a contribution centuries ago, but currently today are making important contributions, and how to support these farmers is really, really important. It's also something very close and dear to me. But let me see, I need to look at the questions. Okay, here is the first question. If we are able to switch to a more regenerative agricultural model, what kind of role do you see animal food products, meat, dairy, eggs, fish, playing in the diet? Good question.
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Because I've been speaking a lot about the sort of land portion of the food system, that part of the supply chain or of the process, and not a whole lot about what that means when you go from land to potentially processing to distribution, and then ultimately to what folks are eating, and how the nature of our diet across this whole country, across the world, then actually impacts what's possible on land. And so this question, specifically about the role of animal products, I think is really complex and really important. And this is, gosh, this conversation is one of the ones that my students and I really go deep on, that they have a lot of questions about, because a lot of students I teach are thinking about, should I become a vegetarian? Should I become a vegan? Is it responsible to eat meat? And that's a tough question, I think. And I think it's not as easily answered as maybe would be sort of comfortable to kind of like have an answer to this and then apply it to your life. So I think, the person asking this question, I think, is absolutely right to identify that the meat production system is a big part of the problem with current agriculture, that climate emissions that come from food and agriculture in the US and around the world. Obviously, we have a huge methane problem that stems from the fact that we have concentrated animal feeding operations. The way that manure is managed is not consistent with sort of how the natural world works or ecology. Methane is being emitted. And then also when you think about dedicating land to growing feed for animals that are in concentrated animal feeding operations and all the fertilizer used, there's a lot of embodied energy and water and emissions in sort of our current animal production system. So I think that absolutely has to change. I don't think the factory farm model is sustainable or sort of desirable from the standpoint of public health or environmental health. And at the same time, it was really fascinating to talk to Latrice Tatsy about, her people's long-standing relationship with grazing animals. Certainly bison as having been really, really important to the history of the North American prairie and people of the North American prairie. And yet also that cattle are a way that Indigenous people in Montana and other places have been able to continue some of their lifeways in relationship to land, even in the context of colonization. And Latrice, as somebody who really advocates for bison restoration, is actually not somebody who's advocating for eradicating cattle altogether. Her family has cattle. She works with tribal cattle producers. She's interested in the idea that indigenous cattle producers can learn from bison grazing. And as they rebuild those relationships from bison, that can actually inform the way they manage cattle. So I think, if we embrace a future in which animals are integrated into those kinds of regenerative systems that are informed by those longstanding relationships, that is going to require that the percentage of protein in our diets in the United States coming from meat is lower. If we want to eat better meat, we're going to have to eat less meat. And that goes for dairy as well. And actually, prior to this project, I spent a lot of time talking with farmers who grow pulse crops, who grow plant-based proteins. And I think that's obviously one of the other places that component of our diet can come from. And then also, health researchers will tell you that Americans probably eat way more protein and think they need to eat more protein than they do already. So yeah, in a nutshell, I think less meat, better meat is a good way to go if we want to have animals integrated into landscapes in ecological ways.
Well, this opens a very interesting. The next question, Liz. I live in the Midwest, where corn and soy rotations dominate the landscape, and the industrialized system dominates the narratives about modern farming. These commodity crops are increasingly sprayed with herbicides that kill biodiversity both in and on the soil. There's such a strong political support for the system, which ironically often label greenwash as using regenerative methods. Did any of the individuals who spoke with discuss ways to dismantle this exploitative machine?
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that question, and thanks for being where you are and asking those questions. My mother was born and raised in Waterloo, Iowa, and have a lot of people, friends and family in that part of the world, and I appreciate the challenges of the political and economic juggernaut that you're up against in that part of the world and trying to make changes. And I do think it's the responsibility of us all. As much as I appreciate how hard people in the Midwest who are engaged in alternative forms of agriculture are working, to try to push back on that system and try to create space for an alternative food system. I think it's important for people all over the country to ask questions about, like, where is my pension fund investing in land, and how do they think about maximizing their returns, and what kind of farming system are they empowering? And I think it's important. I do think it's going to require regulatory policy. One very important arena for that is water quality. And we've already seen, I think, a lot of sort of political activity on that front with Des Moines Water Works and all of the battles about who's going to pay for the expense that the city of Des Moines has in cleaning up the water that's coming from areas that, obviously there's a lot of nitrogen pollution in that water, in that watershed, because people are overusing synthetic fertilizer and they don't have roots in the ground all year round. So it's, draining into this watershed. So I think, kind of basic public health regulation is going to be really important to help spur that change. I think, enforcing existing antitrust legislation. And then I'm in support of some of the more aggressive antitrust policy, acknowledging that, food is a public good and we cannot allow food to become heavily concentrated and dominated by multinationals. So I do think we're going to need some federal policy to help spur these kinds of changes. And at the same time, Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, the Savannah Institute. I can think of just so many amazing groups within those kinds of Midwestern agricultural communities that are also doing the work from the bottom up.
Yeah, in fact, let me just go straight to the other question. And this is a very interesting question because it's a big debate, and there's a whole literature on that. And can these small polyculture farms produce sufficient food supplies to feed the ever-growing population? I mean, this is a common. This is part of a very important debate, and it's not just in the U.S. but in the world. So I think it's an excellent point, excellent question to you.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I think to the conversation we were just having, Mauricio, about the way that we sort of get introduced to the idea that the United States food system is, like the best in history and super productive. It's generating a lot of biomass, I'll give it that. but a shockingly small portion of that biomass is actually making its way into our bodies as food and as nutritional food. And so I think the most important thing to be said about the industrial agricultural system that we currently have in the United States is that it's tremendously wasteful by every metric. And so this system that's very export oriented and where the sort of concerns of producers are very disconnected from the needs of consumers, what it leads to is so many forms of waste. So growing all these feed crops on land that could be growing food crops. And so you're losing so much energy in that conversion ratio to these animals and concentrated animal feeding operations. Just the tremendous loss along the supply chain, the waste in the grocery store, the ugly vegetables that get rejected, tremendous amount of waste that we have kind of on the consumer end. So that, to me, that's the opportunity, is to close those waste gaps. And that's what I think some of these more regional scale polycultural food systems characterized by food sovereignty and these strong forms of governance, what those kinds of food systems are really good at is minimizing waste. And just one example that I learned about in researching this book, there's a just absolutely brilliant book called Zapotec Science, that sort of chronicles the food system in a Zapotec village over a period of time. It's written by an anthropologist, Roberto Gonzalez. And there's a lot of really important things about it. But one of the things that he documents is how little waste there is in this polycultural food system that everybody in the society is participating in some way, because everybody is involved in these tightly coupled relationships between production and consumption. And there's always, the food is grown purposefully with consumption in mind, and then everybody knows how to make use of what's produced. And so that, I think, is where we have an opportunity to kind of meet these very difficult challenges of climate change and, trying to have food security and environmental stewardship at the same time. We need to be thinking about food systems that are not wasteful. And I think, these more regional polycultures are very good at that.
Okay, good, excellent. Actually, there is Amanda Ellis who has her raised hand, and why not so if she can participate.
Hi, Amanda.
Hi, this has just been such a wonderful, wonderful insight. And my stepson is actually studying bisons and soil science in South Dakota. So I've been learning a lot about it as a stepmom as well. And just think that this kind of approach, which we're seeing here in Hawaii in a small way, is really now beginning to take off. And as this research is done around soil sequestration of CO2, this becomes a really critical part of a better future as we look at addressing the climate crisis, as well as these intersectional issues related to colonization, Indigenous peoples' rights, and of course, eating a healthier diet. So this has been just a fantastic presentation. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Amanda. And yeah, wow, Hawaii, incredible work going on. Indigenous communities in Hawaii, revitalizing those food systems. I cannot wait to make another visit out there. I'm always really inspired and impressed by those efforts.
Good, great. We are actually getting more questions. I just wanted to read a comment by Jamie Scott Guthrie that says that goes back to it's very relevant to the previous questions about she sorry, sometimes I don't know exactly. Seems challenging to scale up polyculture to meet the needs of a global population that relies on a global market. The thread of productivity runs long through a commodified food system. That's, you basically addressed that part. Well, the next question, do you find that the education sector is doing enough to educate the younger generation about regenerative agriculture and the benefits to both physical health and ecological health. I find that so many of us are really set in our food habits by the time we reach university, and I wonder about the shift in our education system. And furthermore, I worry that this will get blocked with the restrictions around critical race theory, etc., as people try to educate K-12 around the historical context of this topic. This is more of a comment, but your comments on that.
That's a great point. And yeah, I mean, anybody out there who's working on school garden stuff, more power to you. I think that's really important work. I guess I'm fortunate to be in the California context because I think we have a little bit less of those kinds of ahistorical interventions in curriculum, although there are parts of California that are certainly struggling with that. But yeah, I think absolutely. I think it's, I mean, there's incredible research demonstrating that if young people, like elementary school students have the opportunity to actually grow vegetables themselves, they're far more interested in eating them. So I think you're right on that this is something that ideally would start very early in life, cultivating a relationship with land, and a sense that that relationship with land is also the source of your relationship with food.
There's another more of a comment about herbicides and farming and realizing all the harm that they do create to the waterways and to the soil. So, but this is more of a general comment. And then there's another comment where Janine asked whether whether we have, or what would be your comments if you're aware of the efforts of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In Africa. I mean, this goes beyond the US, but in a way it's trying to bring at least a perspective, a framework of that is very American, US centric into Africa, and I'm very familiar with that. But what, are you familiar with it? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah. Well, I guess in some ways with this book, one of the things I'm trying to suggest is that here in the United States with our food system, we need to get our own house in order before we start exporting our model of food and agriculture around the world. And I would suggest that, the model that has been put forth on this continent by the sort of dominant forces in the food system over the last couple hundred years is precisely not something that we want to replicate. It's something we want to heal and learn from. And I think the the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSI, I have been very interested to hear their position on this Gates Foundation initiative in Africa. And they're quite concerned and quite critical and feel like it undermines the food sovereignty of African communities to define their food systems themselves. And I'm always very concerned when an entity with a lot of resources is proposing a technical solution to a social problem. I think that tends to do more harm than good. I think that, various tools and technologies can be useful in regenerative agriculture. And I think all the folks I spoke to would discourage anybody from thinking that what we're up to is trying to return to the past. I think we want to make use of technologies that we are developing, but from a standpoint of food sovereignty, those technologies need to be conceived of by communities that are governing their own food systems and not just sort of, transferred willy-nilly across continents, imagining that there's some sort of silver bullet that solves food systems issues everywhere.
Another interesting comment by Candice Carr, which makes the point that, global population is projected to peak in about 25 years, and it's going to start going down. So obviously this also presents, and this has been also part of a lot of discussions. I don't know if you probably, not many of, well, you read The Economist, for example, they talk about the problems of a shrinking populations. Many of us will think, well, that's great that there's going to be less people in the planet. So I think it's also the point of the comment is perhaps in a world where the population is shrinking, the opportunities for these agricultural systems are also we have to rethink better these agricultural systems. And another comment, let me go through another comment, and then you can answer together, is 4-H and FFA are strongly influenced by big ag, and underfunded schools gladly make money from fast food promotional efforts. So you could comment on those two comments. Comment on those two comments.
Yes, I think I saw that. Was that from Melissa? Hi, Melissa. Melissa's amazing. She's actually doing a lot of work to try to solve these problems, Melissa Hemmelgarn. Yes, you're right. And this is one of those cases, and we see it across the food system, where when public investment is retracted, then private interests come in and fill that space and reshape it according to their own priorities. And so we clearly see that in public agricultural research, which was much more robustly funded a generation ago, which at least gave an opportunity for the public to sort of weigh in on the priorities of those researchers. And as things like extension get hollowed out, then we see agricultural researchers all of a sudden having to go get their funding from private corporations, and then ask research questions that are of interest. So all of a sudden they're much more focused on research questions that center around, input dependent agriculture, because it's the people making the inputs that are funding the research. And so the same thing, I think, to your point about education, in K-12, if we have robust public funding for, garden education programs, then we don't have to go, 4-H and FFA basically are doing the same thing. They're getting a lot of support from more agro-industry type of groups. And so perhaps, kind of indoctrinating our young people in that way of thinking about agriculture. So it's absolutely critical that we robustly fund these kinds of public programs in the food system, such that those gaps aren't then filled by private sources of funding that come with their own priorities.
Yeah, there's another very interesting comment that also meshes very well with what you were talking about. And this comment has to do about the injustice that the current agricultural system to the way farm workers are treated and left unprotected, particularly not only about pesticides. And I think that now that I'm living in Arizona, I can appreciate, I'd never appreciate that so much, the heat. I mean, really, I cannot imagine. I had the opportunity as part of my job to go and do sampling in some rancher soils during the summer last year. And I was just there for a few minutes, half an hour, and it was amazing. I mean, the heat, at 115. So I cannot imagine people working day in and out at 100 and something every day for 8 or 10 hours. So that is a very important issue, and that has to do also with, how many of these farmers are treated and exploited.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's unconscionable. I mean, we have essentially tolerated slavery or conditions that approximate it as the basis of our agricultural labor system from the beginnings of this country. And that hasn't been seriously questioned. Agricultural laborers were left out of all those key labor laws that came out of the New Deal period. California has tried to reincorporate at the state level. There's been some efforts to correct this, but still, yeah, we basically see that the way we deal with the need for labor in the industrial agriculture system is we find a way to create some kind of underclass that does not enjoy the typical sort of rights of citizenship, and in many cases, like basic human rights. And that's necessary to prop up the current system that we have. So, a lot of people invested in agribusiness find themselves trying to deny, ignore that that's what's happening with labor. And we must confront that this is, just a huge stain on our country, that we allow this to happen, that it's legal, or in some cases it's illegal, but laws aren't being enforced.
Well, we're almost, let me read the last question, because we are almost running out of time, but an excellent presentation discussion. And this is, Liz, do you believe that the Gates Foundation is doing more harm than good, as they are so focused on big ag and profit-driven corporate structures?
That's a good question. Is it more harm than good? I mean, I just think it's time to look to the leadership of communities themselves. And, you know, if I had a one-on-one audience with Bill Gates, you know, I would encourage really, instead of trying to define priorities, just giving that money, you know, just reparations. I think that's, I think, you know, there is a huge reckoning happening in philanthropy right now about the way in which in the past, philanthropists have expected that having a lot of money means that they also get to essentially come into positions of governance to decide, you know, how that money is spent. And I think the much more powerful thing to do is to recognize, you know, where that wealth came from, you know, have some kind of historical sense, and then give money to the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa and say, you know, you all know how best to solve these problems in your own community, and it's an honor to be an ally.
Great, great, Liz. So, you know, so just to finalize, Michelle will place in the chat a link to buy Liz's book from the locally owned and beloved Changing Hands bookstore. And I just want to thank you and all the participants for the great questions, first for your presentation, for the great questions that they presented, the comments as well. And thank you for being with us today. With that, I think we are ready to close this very nice session.
Thank you so much, Mauricio, Michelle, everybody at Arizona State, and everybody so much for your attention and your great questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.